Welcome to our panel discussion on the upcoming proxy season. My name is LizAnn Eisen, and I'm an acting professor of the practice at Cornell Tech and Cornell Law School. I also have the pleasure of being the faculty director for two executive education programs, one for general counsels and the Cornell Tech Board of Directors Forum. We have upcoming in-person programs for both. More information on those programs is in the chat. In addition, at this point, I'd like to ask you to put any questions that you have in the chat. Today, we are kicking off a series of 6 eCornell discussions on topics that are at the forefront for those who are working in business, especially with public companies and almost public companies. Given the time of year, proxy season will soon be upon us. What is proxy season? It is the 3 or so month period during the spring when most public companies hold their annual shareholder meetings. It is a time of more intense company engagement with all shareholders. We are going to talk about today some of the key things that investors have said they want to hear about from companies, including ESG matters, shorthand for environmental, social, and governance, AI, cybersecurity, and if we have time, executive compensation. Today, I'm lucky to be joined by 2 governance experts, Michael Arnold and Liz Morgan. I'm going to break from my usual rule of alphabetical order of introductions because Liz is a Cornell Law School alumna. She has had a long and distinguished legal career both in the United States and in Australia. She is currently a partner at King & Spalding, where she represents public and private companies, as well as investment banks and investors in a broad range of capital markets transactions, as well as on corporate governance and disclosure matters. Liz regularly advises public companies and their boards of directors on corporate governance, securities law, and ESG and sustainability matters, including best practices and disclosures. Thanks, Liz, for joining us. Michael Arnold is a partner at Cravath, Swaine & Moore LLP, where he is a member of the corporate governance and board advisory practice. Michael counsels clients with respect to their most sensitive and highest risk matters, advising boards of directors and senior management on a broad range of corporate governance, public reporting, disclosure, and compliance matters, including in connection with restatements and other financial crises, as well as cybersecurity incidents. He also advises companies on matters relating to ESG activism, voluntary and mandatory ESG reporting, and ESG-related governance processes. Mr. Arnold currently serves as the co-chair of the American Bar Association's ESG subcommittee, a joint subcommittee of the Corporate Governance Committee and the Federal Regulation of Securities Committees. With that, let's get started with some ESG. It has obviously been a huge topic in the last several years, so help us understand the trajectory of ESG over the course of the last few proxy seasons and the outlook for this upcoming proxy season.
I'll jump in and start. Thanks, LizAnn. Great to be here today and look forward to a great conversation. So, Michael, please interrupt at any time. This is a great question to get the ball rolling here because we could talk about this question for the entire hour. The past few years in terms of ESG and proxy season have been a roller coaster ride. It's like a roller coaster where you get on and it takes off really quickly, goes up a hill, and then gets to the top. And I think that's where we got to last year. Now there's a little bit of a downward trajectory and we're starting to ride it downhill. So here's the headline. And when we talk purely about shareholder proposals, so far this year, and it is still early days, the numbers are looking like they'll be down. This is a continuation of, or maybe a cousin of, what we started to see last year, which was lower levels of support from investors for ESG, particularly E&S shareholder proposals. But the landscape is really complicated. So just to zoom out a little bit, we talk about shareholder proposals a lot when we talk about proxy season, because even though only a small, albeit maybe expanding number of public companies actually get shareholder proposals, they serve as a proxy, and I guess that's a pun intended, for talking about investor priorities and hot governance topics that are pervasive in the market and in conversations that companies are having with their investors and other stakeholders. So taking a few steps back, over the past few years, starting really back in 2020, we saw an explosion of E&S shareholder proposals. Then fast forwarding, going into the 2022 shareholder proposal season, the SEC changed the game a little bit. The SEC changed their approach for permitting the exclusion of shareholder proposals. I won't get too deep into the weeds here. There's an excellent memo that Michael wrote in the materials that we provided for CLE credit here. You can go and read that and learn all about the details here. But at a very high level, the Division of Corporation Finance of the SEC published what we call SLAB 14L. This made it harder for companies to exclude a lot of shareholder proposals that would have been excludable before. So what we saw was a lot more shareholder proposals going to a vote. But then what we also saw was decreasing levels of support for shareholder proposals. So that's kind of where we found ourselves at the end of the year last year. Companies were seeing really strong support that a lot of environmental and social proposals had received back in 2021, and they had gone to work. Companies were working to address the social and environmental concerns that were being raised in those shareholder proposals. So then the next year, that helped to insulate them from some of the more aggressive proposals that came. Companies have been able to exclude more proposals, negotiate the withdrawal, or if those proposals were going to a vote because they weren't excludable, they were getting lower levels of support because we saw very prescriptive language there. And that really opened the door for investors to take a step back and say, is this something we want to support?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll jump in there. And thanks for the kind introduction, LizAnn. Certainly no offense taken that the Cornell premium means that Liz gets to go first. So totally understood. I think Liz hit the nail on the head, really, on kind of the trajectory of ESG. I mean, you had to be living under a rock if you had not heard about ESG in 2020. And if you were a public company and you were not taking steps to sort of engage with ESG, you were getting a ton of engagement from your shareholders. You were seeing a lot of, proposals going to companies that were otherwise not really under the gun for shareholder proposals. Typically shareholder proposals go much more to kind of the brand name, household name sort of companies. And we saw that expanding with sort of the huge boom in ESG. Because of that sort of extreme expansion, I agree that companies sort of took a lot of low-hanging fruit off the table for sort of ESG engagement and ESG shareholder proposals. And I think the other key dynamic is, the investors are also being a little bit more thoughtful and a little bit more particularized. In 2020, I think investors were really under the gun due to, a lot of kind of the social movements that were happening at the time to put their money where their mouth was. If they were sort of making statements on ESG related issues, there was a great deal of pressure for them to kind of back that up with their proxy voting record. So a lot of proposals that they maybe, wouldn't have supported in other periods, they felt really kind of compelled to support. And now I think you're seeing the investors be a little bit more particularized and really assess more carefully, okay, what is actually, material to the companies in which I'm voting? What are their real ESG related risks? It's not going to be the same for every company, and modify their voting a little bit there. And, of course, ESG has also become a very politically charged issue as well.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Liz. So some of this sounds like, and these trends are being driven by the backlash to ESG that we've been hearing so much about. Is that right? And if so, what do we need to know about the ESG backlash that seems to be in the news on an almost daily basis?
Yeah, I think you're definitely seeing the backlash to ESG be very, very prominent and get a lot of attention. I mean, you're seeing things on a number of different kind of levels. You see congressional hearings, you're seeing state house hearings, you're seeing state laws, you're seeing political pressure. For the first time, I believe in recorded history, a major presidential candidate made a corporate governance issue part of their campaign with, Vivek Ramaswamy. I have to say, as a corporate governance nerd myself, that's somewhat intriguing, and I don't necessarily expect that to be a recurring phenomenon. That may have been a one ticket to ride sort of thing, just because of the intensity of the backlash to ESG. So I agree, it's certainly out there and it's getting a lot of attention. I would be a little bit hesitant, though, to ascribe too much of the effect on kind of the proxy season dynamics, the roller coaster dynamics that Liz was talking about, to the backlash to ESG. It's getting a lot of headlines, but realistically, if you look at kind of the big three asset managers, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, a lot of the other sort of people who are managing significant amounts of money and are really the most influential in the proxy season, for them, ESG has been much more about sort of a risk management perspective. Understanding that these three factors, environmental, social, and governance, have potential risks that affect the actual bottom line of companies, and an expectation that these ESG factors are being integrated by companies into their sort of everyday business processes. So not necessarily kind of, here's our operations over here, and here's what we do for, corporate social responsibility, but sort of really more of an integration within ESG. That's really been the perspective that I think a lot of the big investors have always been taking to ESG. And so while there's so much of this rhetoric and kind of, noise in the ESG arena, I think in many respects, you're not seeing the anti-ESG backlash really move too much in the actual kind of voting behavior, but more in sort of how the investors are kind of framing their view and really emphasizing what I think has always been the case of ESG is really a way of managing risk.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. In the shareholder proposal arena, last year we did start to see more of what people would categorize as anti-ESG proposals. And, it was interesting because it was, is this a balance? Is this going to kind of complement on one side what's happening on the other side? But at the end of the day, average support for anti-ESG proposals was around 5%. And while we know that several anti-ESG proponents have signaled that they will continue to submit proposals along the lines of the proposals we saw last year, I think we should also expect that these will continue to be politically motivated, polarizing to some extent, intended to generate media attention, and they'll continue to get low support from voters. But I agree, Michael. I think ESG has been a very fraught area in 2023. Part of this is being driven by political dynamics, what we're seeing at the state level, what we're seeing at Congress. We're seeing increased fragmentation in the US, particularly around issues concerning ESG investment considerations and diversity. And we saw a case of the Supreme Court, Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard, that ruled that universities can no longer consider race in admissions decisions. And that has resulted in significant activism and litigation against companies and other organizations, notwithstanding the relatively limited scope of the court's decision. So these diversity-related developments, which have involved a wide range of claims, I think are likely to continue in 2024 and beyond. And, in addition, we're faced with the potential erosion of Chevron deference by a pending Supreme Court case. This would be relevant to what the SEC does, particularly as we think about a potential climate rule. But all of these things kind of off to the side, I think ESG and the issues that underlie ESG will continue to be a major topic, whatever we call it.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Michael. So that leads us directly into our next area, which I'd like to go a little bit deeper into each of the E, the S, and the G. So let's start with the E. How about environmental matters in the upcoming proxy season?
So, this is an interesting one. The SEC's regulatory agenda includes the finalization of a proposed climate disclosure rule this spring. Now, that is just a proposed agenda that may or may not happen, but April 2024 is the date everyone has circled on their calendars because of the agenda. So with that looming in the background, that's one thing to keep in mind. It's already a challenging environment for public companies, particularly those with a global footprint, because we're seeing in Europe the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that's a mouthful, but came into force earlier this year. And the first companies will be subject to reporting requirements, I believe, for financial years starting this year. There's another European rule, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, that is going to require reporting by in-scope companies. The ISSB has proposed voluntary global sustainability disclosure standards. And back closer to home, California arguably beat the SEC to the punch by passing a climate-related disclosure laws last year that come into effect starting this year. Now, those are currently being challenged by the Chamber of Commerce, which is an interesting dynamic. But that's just on the climate front. So there's this huge rise in mandatory regulatory requirements that companies are facing. And public companies are wringing their hands kind of increasingly behind the scenes to figure out not only what they need to do to comply with these mandatory and voluntary regimes, balance that with what their investors are looking for, sync that up with what their business objectives, priorities are, what their risks and opportunities are, and kind of write their own story in terms of what their environmental priorities are. And so that's kind of what's going on in the background. And then when you take that lens and you apply it to proxy season, where does that leave us? So companies are already adopting a lot of goals and reporting on goals. And because they're doing that, they may be better positioned to negotiate with proponents and argue against shareholder proposals that show up. But on the other hand, interim reporting of progress that may be required by some of these mandatory reporting regimes could prompt more shareholder proposals, forcing companies or asking companies to accelerate their progress or set more aggressive goals or expand some of the initiatives. So I think that climate-related proposals were the #1 most popular shareholder proposal last year, period. And I think that is likely to continue this year. I think we will continue to see other proposals in the environmental front, but I think it's important to keep in mind all these dynamics in the background that kind of drive company behavior.
Yeah. Look, I agree with all that. I mean, just a word on shareholder engagement. LizAnn, in your introduction, you described that one of the key elements of proxy season, separate and apart from any voting, is really just this is the time when companies are trying to engage with their shareholders and really kind of convey, have this sort of dialogue with them. I think increasingly engagement on ESG issues is now sort of a year-round endeavor, but this is really prime time. One dynamic that I think we've seen with a lot of clients is an increasing sort of bifurcation in shareholder expectations based on sort of the investor base. I mean, if you have a lot of European investors, separate and apart from the CSRD sort of dynamics that apply to kind of operating companies, European investors have a lot of sort of, EU specific requirements as well. Sort of, are their investments light green, dark green? Needless to say, there are hundreds of more acronyms that you would need to learn to actually understand kind of the developments in that space. But that's putting European investors under the gun as well, which then sort of flows down to their engagement with companies. There's the more sort of anti-greenwashing enforcement there is, both in the U.S. and also in Europe, that I think increases the pressure on investors to sort of put their money where their mouth is and really kind of prioritize environmental issues when they're engaging with companies. So I think if you will oftentimes now see companies having to sort of really engage more deeply with some of their European investors than they would have otherwise, just because the expectations are so robust on that side. But look, everyone is engaging quite a bit on climate-related issues. Just yesterday, EY released one of their investor surveys that they take from time to time. The #1 engagement topic for investors was climate-related risks and opportunities, particularly for those sort of high-emitting companies, extractive companies, transportation companies, et cetera. If you're one of those sorts of companies, you should really expect, sustained investor engagement. And as these disclosure requirements continue to multiply and become more and more complicated, that's just more ammunition for more stakeholder engagement. Every time that you have to report progress, the dynamic Liz was describing, if you have to report progress along an interim goal and you're going to be reporting that you're not about to meet your 2025 commitment, your 2030 commitment is looking in jeopardy, which, by the way, is the case for many companies, because I think a lot of companies took a big swing at what they could promise. That's going to be a topic of shareholder engagement, not just this proxy season, but for the foreseeable future.
And I think that we have a lot of conversations with clients around the lines of, what do we do while we're waiting, right? I feel like our hands are tied. And I think the answer is your hands are not tied. And And we may wait for a long time. So it's best to formulate a plan, prioritize what your strategies are, identify your risks and opportunities, and move forward. The SEC has been very focused on climate-related disclosures and lack thereof inside and outside of SEC filings. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind as you think about engaging with investors in a very candid way.
Great. Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Michael. I think we've had a couple questions in the chat, but I'd like to get through the E, the S, and the G, and because one of them is sort of how does ESG fit into value, and so and does it drive value? And the other thing, Liz, that you said that really resonated with me is that companies' hands are not tied, particularly because we don't know what all of the regulations, disclosure regulations will look like, and they're likely not to be all harmonized. And so there's going to have to be some picking and choosing about how it is that companies are moving forward. So a sensible plan seems to be one that you can defend with your investors as making sense for your business. It's a long way of saying there's no one size fits all approach to the E part of ES and G. So now let's turn to the S part of ESG, and in particular, DEI matters. How is DEI affecting proxy season?
Well, my view is it's a step behind the E, at least for now, but stay tuned. As Liz said, DEI is very much a kind of live political issue. You have a lot of the kind of dialogue about diversity in the Supreme Court case. I think that also plays into an increasingly common issue that companies are confronting is, when do we comment on these sorts of live kind of controversial issues? When does it make sense for my company to be out there speaking on that? And some of that in S issues can be even more complicated, right? I think that is where you see a lot of the backlash to ESG is particularly, on some of the most controversial issues, which could be very important also to your employees. Unsurprisingly, the regulatory regime also has an overlay here on sort of the S dynamics within proxy season. In 2020, the SEC put out human capital management proposals, disclosure requirements, which companies are kind of complying with now. I think there was, on the investor side, there is a desire for more information about human capital management and kind of how the company thinks about its talent and its employees and how it relates to them. So that is a consistent theme of engagement, I think, that companies are dealing with from their investors. You also see corporate board diversity on the regulatory flexibility agenda from the SEC. So there could be proposals for human capital management and board diversity disclosures soon. They're also identified as April items, and I think there are various rumors you hear about where that kind of fits within the extremely busy regulatory agenda that the SEC has on a number of fronts, not just in kind of the corporation finance, public company side, but also a lot of market structure. So, that could affect proxy season. I think realistically, though, what we're really seeing in the key area is probably board diversity, I would say. Going back to the EY survey I mentioned earlier, the workforce and board diversity was the #2 engagement topic, right behind climate, which was #1. And I think you do see it sort of driving S issues, and in particular board diversity, I think do drive voting results during proxy season. Though, again, the dynamic, I think, has been shifting from one size fits all, very rigid, thou shalt have this level of diversity on your board. That's our expectation as investors. You see that dynamic shifting a little bit to be a bit more kind of particularized and a bit more sort of focusing on what really makes sense for the company in particular. Vanguard very recently revised its voting policies to be less specific on when it will vote against directors because of a perceived lack of diversity on the board, and make it more as a sort of holistic determination of, is the board sort of fit for purpose? Does it have the right mix of backgrounds, skills, et cetera? So again, I think the real dynamic here is that investors, in order, partially driven by the backlash to being seen to be being very prescriptive on ESG matters, you see investors sort of taking every company individually, and that just means it all the more important for companies to explain how S issues kind of fit into their board and how they think about those issues.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think from the company perspective, approaching engagement season with a good sense of what your peers have done on the DEI front is really helpful, because that's who you're being measured against. You may have a perfectly defensible reason why your disclosures are different and why your board composition is different, why diversity is handled differently throughout the company. But I think it is important to have that kind of benchmarking in mind as you go into conversations with investors, because these topics are top of mind. And we've used this cliche a few times today, but there is no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to DEI or any other S issues. I mean, we know from talking to investors that the talent agenda is a huge priority. But what that means is really different depending on what your industry is, whether you have a unionized workforce, a global workforce. It's very different for Silicon Valley tech companies and for Detroit auto companies. So it's just important to keep that in mind as you think about what are your priorities. And shareholder proposals that are directly relevant to the business of the company, as opposed to broader societal concerns, are probably going to resonate more with investors. On the shareholder proposal front, in the S category, some of the other issues that we see coming up are labor rights proposals and human rights matters. I think we'll continue to see prescriptive proposals demanding publication of reports, like on human rights risk assessments. And I'm personally interested to see how the recent regulatory developments outside of the US change the landscape and investor expectations on human rights initiatives in particular, particularly with respect to due diligence and disclosures around human rights. So that's something that I'm interested to see how it plays out over this proxy season. What else? Last year, we saw proposals related to reproductive rights following the Dobbs decision. We may continue to see proposals in that vein this year. And I think I mentioned that because in all three of the categories, the E, the S, and the G, shareholder proposals and what we see in proxy season is often driven by what's going on in the market. But more broadly on the S front, we are still seeing some proposals asking companies to disclose their EEO-1 data. We know those are floating out there. We know that continues to be a priority for investors. It's still part of the conversation and engagement.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think one of the macro issues is investors want data, right? I mean, in order to justify their own ESG commitments, it's important for them to have kind of comparable data. That's really the trend that's driving the SEC's proposals, the developments in Europe. It's a data hungry market. And so if and when we see human capital management, rules from the SEC, I think you will see them being much more sort of metric driven. There will be requirements for very specific metrics. I think that will then feed into, as Liz said, sort of the S trend is really, give us a report that tells us as investors about your progress on these various metrics. I think in that way, the sort of engagement and shareholder proposal dynamic and the engagement and the sort of regulatory requirements, work very close in tandem.
Great, thank you. So as we move into the last initial of ESG, governance, that's also obviously a big part of proxy season. So what are some of the key trends?
So here, my head first goes to universal proxy and the impact that the universal proxy system has had on disclosures. Last year was the first year that the universal proxy card was mandatory for contested director elections. And what that meant was all director nominees, whether they were being put forward by the company or by a dissident, showed up on one card. So the universal proxy card enabled shareholders to vote for any combination of directors on a single proxy card. You can mix and match, you don't have to pick and choose. From the company perspective, on the one hand, this is making director elections more personal and putting a spotlight on individual directors. But on the other hand, on the positive side, it's really created an opportunity here for companies to revisit their disclosures around why each director is fit for purpose and to tell the story of why this person has the right skills to oversee the company's most important risks. What is the company's strategy? What skills does this person have that are relevant to the company's strategic objectives? It's created an opportunity to take a step back and to look at the skills disclosure, to think about what skills does this person have that are most relevant to the risks that we're overseeing? How do we want to tell that story? And before, I think we had gotten stuck in a rut a little bit where those disclosures had become boilerplate and we were cutting and pasting from other proxies or just looking at peers and making sure that it was generally in the ballpark. But I think a lot more time is being spent thinking about how is this board actually governing the company and what should we be telling investors here? Even in uncontested elections, last year we started to see that investors were willing to vote against individual directors to hold them accountable on particular issues. And that was a shift. I think last year was really the first time that that made a meaningful difference in some of the voting results that we saw. And we saw investors engaging directly with companies and saying, this is why we did not support this particular director. I think that's a trend that we'll continue to see this year. But that's also a trend that companies are taking to heart and spending a lot of time thinking about what can I be doing with my disclosures to preempt those kinds of decisions? And what can I be doing during engagement to kind of scratch the surface and figure out what people aren't happy about before it's too late?
Yeah, I agree with that dynamic, kind of making skills and sort of individualized descriptions. Universal proxy really puts that at a premium. I mean, you see now, proxy fights have never been warm and fuzzy. I don't think it's fair to say, but now when you are very specifically saying the director that we as a dissident do not want is, Bob, Alice, whoever, like you are actually identifying a specific director that you are asking shareholders to vote out. I think that makes it really just heightens sort of the dynamics there. The one thing I will say is, so that may be the kind of positive effect of universal proxy, what has actually happened. I think it's worth noting what has not really been an effect of universal proxy, which is widespread activism and a significant uptick in sort of activist activity. I think at the outset, that was something that a lot of companies were very worried about. Does this make running a proxy fight significantly more attractive to, first of all, regular way activists, sort of your traditional activists who bring, do activism with the traditional theory of M&A, governance change, whatever, but also potentially ESG activism. Of course, engine number one will be the way that everybody thinks about sort of ESG activism. I mean, it was truly a transformative, a very interesting campaign that is now, a few years old. And I think just it was not really a playbook that has been repeated, meaningfully. I mean, it has informed the way people think about ESG activism, but you did not see sort of the systematic sea change as a result of universal proxy and a proliferation of activism by ESG investors. That just really hasn't happened. Because everyone was ready for an explosion of activism after the universal proxy rules went into effect, one thing that a lot of companies did was go back and look at their advance notice bylaws and sort of, make, on the one hand, some sort of ministerial changes just to make sure that, the mechanics work right with universal proxy, but also in some cases really heightening the requirements around what dissidents need to provide, the amount of information that dissidents need to provide in order to make a nomination. I think that one of kind of the biggest trends right now in the G space, and we're seeing it already in proxy season, is focus on advance notice bylaws. Two Delaware cases are very significant in this space. The first centering around some amendments to the advance notice bylaws at a company called Massimo, where I think it's fair to say they implemented probably the most aggressive version of a lot of different pieces of technology that you could put into your advance notice bylaws. And it really prompted an investor reaction among sort of traditional activists and their advisors, yes, but also among, I would say, investors that are not sort of associated with activism. It really just seemed that the company had kind of maybe taken a step too far in their advance notice bylaws, and they ended up walking those back. The second Delaware case that's active right now is called Kellner. It also is, put advance notice bylaws under the microscope. The Delaware Chancery Court went through and kind of blue penciled, I think it's fair to say, certain advance notice bylaws were just to require too much information, and information that was not actually relevant to the board making a determination about whether to put a dissident on their board or not. It was really just a procedural hurdle to try to slow down a proxy fight. And then some provisions that were being kind of litigated in this Kellner case were upheld as asking for an appropriate level of information. So, what are the takeaways for companies on this? I think it's all about balance. Recognizing that your advance notice bylaws are a really critical tool in being ready for activism. I think it is totally legitimate for the board to get a lot of information to be able to kind of understand the people who are potentially going to be joining the board of directors. There's a lot of information. It's very legitimate to get, but you have to be careful and walk the line that you don't go too far. You can't there are risks to being a little too aggressive in this space as well. Just to kind of, round it out on the shareholder proposal front, we're seeing now proposals from the Oregon State Treasurer's Office that are asking for a bylaw to say that it is the board's role to determine the eligibility of a director, not the suitability of a director, and sort of expressly promise to treat dissident nominees and company nominations the same. It's an advance notice bylaw fairness proposal, effectively, is the way they're kind of branding it. I think remains to be seen how popular that will be among investors, but I think it underscores that this is one of the kind of biggest trends right now in proxy season is the scope and of advance notice bylaws.
It's, listening to you talk about advance notice bylaws, I was thinking about how I often think about, and this is a gross generalization, but 3 different categories of investors that we think about in proxy season. One is the type of investor who brings a shareholder proposal. One is the Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, the passive, the primary shareholders we're all engaging with. And then the other is the activists, right? And no matter what you do, you kind of need to think about, how is that group of investor going to react? Am I going too far in response to a demand from one to satisfy another? And so the complexities they're all interlinked. And when you start talking about things like advance notice bylaws, which really are targeting the dissident, you have to think about how the middle category is going to react to those when you justify what you're trying to do. So just a kind of high level theoretical thought that it gets very complicated. And I think from a board's perspective and for companies, for lawyers advising boards, it's important to keep in mind the interests of all shareholders and to think about what are the shareholder interests, but also what is the right path for the company here.
Yeah, so, I also think it's worth noting that winning a proxy fight on an advance notice bylaw foot fault, it buys you a year, right? If there's some sort of fundamental issue that your investors have identified in your company, they'll just be back. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have the right business plan, that you have the right mix of skills on your board. The hurdles that you can put up with advance notice bylaws are necessarily going to be kind of limited.
That's right. It doesn't change your risk profile. It buys you a year. LizAnn, did you want us to talk a little bit about compensation right now, or did you want to go to some questions?
I think it would be great to go to some questions and we can circle back to compensation if we have time at the end, because I do want to get to cybersecurity and AI. So 2 questions. First, one from Linda Clarizio is, how many other states besides California are considering passing mandatory climate-related financial disclosures?
Well, I know New York is. It's working its way through the process in the New York legislature. Now, in my view, the most interesting thing that could potentially happen is, what if you have essentially anti-ESG state disclosure requirements, right? I mean, is West Virginia going to have its own sort of twist on what companies need to be reporting and its own series of risks that you need to be reporting? I think the nightmare scenario for companies, obviously, would be a patchwork of 50 different disclosure regimes that suddenly you need to be responding to, in addition to Europe, in addition to the SEC. I mean, in addition to the already fragmented private ordering of ESG. That is something I really worry about. So far, I don't, most of the action on the red state side, I think it's fair to say, has been in kind of on antitrust theories or consumer protection theories, less so on requiring companies to make disclosures, but time will tell. I do know that at least New York is also working on some climate disclosure, however.
Thanks, Michael. And then another question from Stephen Carpenter. How important has ESG been in value creation? Have any studies been done that you're aware of that show that these ESG disclosures and the ESG focus has increased value?
Well, I'll take a first stab. I think it depends on who you ask. I think there are a lot of people who would say absolutely yes. I mean, particularly there was I think it's a McKinsey study that is cited frequently on kind of the benefits of diversity in the boardroom, that it provides, meaningfully better returns if you have diverse perspectives. By the same token, however, I think there's a lot of ways that you can look at the data that, query whether ESG disclosure is actually all that effective in driving value. Or, I mean, there's even some skepticism. Do ESG disclosure regimes even drive sort of ESG outcomes, let alone sort of value creation outcomes? It's a muddy battlefield is the way I would summarize it. And I think, in general, probably I would say the scale maybe tips towards the balance of the academic literature that I've seen, at least, that it is value creating. But I do think there's certainly evidence, on the other side as well.
I agree with that. And I think that a lot of the conversation about ESG really focuses on risk. And if you think about it, whatever you want to call it, ESG funds, the criteria around what is going into that fund is not always clear. So I think if you look at ESG as a way to look at long-term risk and value creation, then yes, but I agree with Michael in terms of summarizing what the studies generally say.
Great. And one more question. Michael, you use the term dark green, light green, anti-green. Could you just give one or two sentences on sort of what does that actually mean?
Yeah, it's a very complicated regime in the EU that sort of requires the investment vehicles to categorize themselves under a series of different articles. So based on sort of the level of rigor at which they take into account, green investing, there are, what the strength to which they are making their investments with an eye towards sustainability is the short answer.
Great, thanks. So let's now turn to two hot topics, AI and cybersecurity. How does that fit into the upcoming proxy season?
Well, I'm sure Liz, like me, has been spending a lot of time talking to clients about cybersecurity, both because of hopefully rarely incidents, but also the new cyber disclosure rules are in effect. So all the year-end companies that are working on their 10Ks are now putting out into those 10Ks cybersecurity disclosure about kind of their risk management processes, some expertise disclosure, et cetera. So that's coming out. You now also, of course, have an 8K trigger if you have a cybersecurity incident that the board has determined to be material. An 8K is due within 4 business days of that determination of materiality. So there's a lot of kind of focus on cybersecurity in the disclosure space. Specifically to proxy process, proxy season, I think it is going to then fall under the general sort of rubric of risk management. One interesting thing about the final cybersecurity rules versus the proposed cybersecurity rules is the proposed requirement was that companies needed to kind of expressly describe where on their board there was cybersecurity expertise. A lot of people who are in sort of the governance, in the good governance circles, I think were a little taken aback by that, because it at least implicitly suggests that you need to have a subject matter expert on your board. And generally, I think the theory has been that optimally composed boards are not, the cyber person, the ESG person, the human capital person, like domain experts. It's really well-rounded people who are able to ask challenging questions. And the best boards are kind of not sort of a siloed version of experts like that. But the SEC did not include that requirement. So I think that probably took a little bit of the pressure off of cyber in proxy season. It is, however, a big theme of investor engagement, and I think investors are going to be reading carefully the 10K sections about cybersecurity. AI is fascinating, though. I mean, AI has really exploded on the scene. I feel like we've been talking about ChatGPT for 10 years at this point. It was introduced like 15 months ago. Like, this has become such a common topic in corporate governance so quickly. And you see it up and down throughout, investors are focused on it. The SEC is focused on it. Gary Gensler said it is nearly unavoidable that AI will trigger a financial crisis, which is pretty strong words. The director of corporation finance at the SEC, Eric Girding, has referred to AI matters in a number of different sort of public speeches. I wouldn't at all be surprised to see a Dear Issuer letter come from the SEC about AI issues. I think what that means is investors are really locked in and focused on this and making the responsible use of AI a topic of engagement this year, really for the first time. You see a few shareholder proposals about calling for reports, again, similar to what Liz mentioned in some of the S proposals, reports on the responsible use of AI. We'll see what level of support those get. If I had to guess, I would say it's going to continue to be a point of focus. A couple proposals will pass, most of them won't. But everyone is going to be focused on this issue, for coming proxy seasons and in corporate governance generally.
So I was watching CNBC this morning, and the CEO of Google was being interviewed, and he was asked the question, how do you think about governance of AI? Which I thought was just fascinating. And he didn't have a great answer. So it's such a hard question. But what he said was, this is such a rapidly evolving area, and we are still trying to figure out what the risks and the opportunities are here. So yes, there is a need and there will be regulation here in terms of a governance structure, but it is something that we're having to figure out as we go, which I thought was very genuine and very accurate, because this is a fact-finding expedition at this point. And I think from the company's perspective, the real focus here is on, how are you using AI? What are you actually doing with it? That is going to allow you to communicate the risks and the governance clearly if you actually think about, how are we using AI? And I think this is something that directors are very focused on, because the unknown is overwhelming to some extent. So kind of taking it in bite-sized pieces, applying the rubric that we've seen in cybersecurity, that we've seen in other areas of new and evolving risks, bringing in experts to come and talk to the board and educate around, how should we be thinking about this? What don't we know? What is knowable that we don't know? And from that perspective, start to bite off little bite-sized pieces so that when you are asked by investors, what are you doing? You have a good answer. And it feels like this is something that's on the agenda. It is in the boardroom. It is being thought about from an ERM perspective, like other risks, and managed in a way that you can clearly communicate to shareholders.
I agree with all that. The one thing that is an even more fundamental question that I think directors really need to have their eye on is, what do we mean when we're saying AI, right? My company is it using AI in the sense of, we just have a traditional algorithm, but because AI is the hot topic, we're going to call it AI? Do we have large language models? Are we contracting with one of sort of the well-known ones? Do we have our own data set that we've built? There's a lot of different ways, a lot of different things are being looped in under this term AI, and being very kind of clear and precise about what you actually mean when you say that is, I think, one of the kind of fundamental premises of effective investor engagement. Being able to very clearly understand and articulate, AI for us means X and not Y.
I think that's a great point. And I think that it's going to become even more important next year, going into regular way engagement, to have the right talking points. Because if you're caught off guard and just start talking, you may say the wrong things. And I think having that narrative built out in advance is very important.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Thanks. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about risk management in the governance context. We hear a lot about risk management. There's a rule requiring how the board thinks about risk disclosure, about how the board thinks about risk oversight. The SEC has recently sent some companies comment letters asking for more robust disclosure in those areas. So how does the theme of risk management arise in proxy season?
It's such a great question, because I think this is just pervasive. And I think we talked about this in the context of ESG. We talked about it in the context of cybersecurity. Risk management is really just critical to what the director's role is. And what we hear more and more from investors is that they want proxy materials to be a window into the boardroom. They want to know what the board is doing. How often are they hearing about various issues? Who are they hearing from? Are they hearing from external experts? Are they hearing from management? What is the board's strategy? How are they prioritizing and addressing risks? And so I think in my mind, that's how risk management ties to proxy season. I think we are way past the point where disclosures can be generic and just responsive to the line item requirements. I think that the best proxies have really good disclosures that tell you what they're doing. And sometimes they feel a little bit exposing. It feels like, wow, this feels like a lot of information. Am I putting myself at risk by saying this? And am I creating more risk here by what I'm not saying? And I think that that's the reality. And there is a delicate balance here, kind of finding the Goldilocks approach to disclosure here that represents what your board is actually doing in terms of risk oversight.
Yeah, I think that's all completely right. I mean, let's go back to the expertise disclosure. It didn't make its way into the cyber rules, but a very similar proposal is in the climate rules, and it remains to be seen if that will make it into the final climate rules. Understanding that relationship between what are the material risks that the company is facing, do we have the right reporting systems to elevate those risks? I mean, think about just good old-fashioned caremark duties under Delaware law. It is an important part of your fiduciary duties as a director to have the warning systems to kind of elevate red flags up into the board and have that be part of the board agenda. All of that ties back to risk management, understanding what those material risks are, understanding the process by which those risks could be surfaced up to the board level and make it onto the board's agenda. And do you have the right expertise within the boardroom to really respond to those risks? I mean, I think one of the things that we saw kind of kick off maybe 4 or 5 years ago was a real push for skills matrices. This was from the New York City Comptroller, I think was one of the sort of progenitors of this trend, but I think a lot of investors have gotten on this train, and including recently Vanguard in their recently updated voting policies. There is a big push to have more specific and very kind of itemized skills disclosure in order for, as Liz said, to have the investors really see into the company, understand, do we have the right mix of skills to manage the risks that are arising? If you, at this point, I think our recommendation is pretty much always to include a skills matrix. The quick and dirty way to do a skills matrix is look at your industry peers, try to understand kind of what are the expectations, but also do some self-reflection, right? I mean, what are the real risks that are affecting us and could affect us? And do we have the right mix of skills in order to sort of address those risks?
And the skills matrix is something that investors will scrutinize, and they will look at it, they will ask questions about it, they will identify gaps or what they perceive to be gaps, and they will want to have conversations about those gaps. And that's a very common topic during shareholder engagement, kind of a focus on board refreshment and a conversation about what is missing here. What is missing as the world evolves, as the company's strategy evolves? Are there skills here where you could be stronger? And this is apart from kind of the conversation of single purpose directors. This is just well-rounded directors who bring a skill to the board that we may not have a lot of, and provide general oversight. So I do think that the skills matrix is a good springboard to kind of start the conversation around board refreshment and prioritize what the company wants to think about as they think about bringing on new directors.
And it's certainly something that nominating and governance committees of the board start with and have a bit of a heavier lift than they might have had in prior years as they start to think about this. I think also to the single issue director or single skill director, I think at least one of the large investors has said they will vote against single skill directors. So communicating why someone may have a particular expertise, but not solely that expertise will become very important in explaining and I hate the word justifying, but really explaining and giving credence to the skills that the directors bring to the table and how they fit together. So we've just got a minute or two left before we wrap up. I would like to turn to the topic of compensation disclosure. We obviously had a very big recent decision out of the Chancery Court on process related to compensation, compensation decisions and pay packages for CEOs. I think there were a few things that I might have found surprising in that decision, but Liz, is there anything you'd like to comment on that?
Sure. So I think you're talking about our friend, Mr. Musk. As a threshold matter, we're talking about the largest potential compensation opportunity ever seen in the public markets by many multiples of magnitude. So the facts there were really extraordinary. But if I had to say two takeaways, and I think two things. One is process, right? We see this again and again in Delaware case law, whether in the compensation area or not. When you're making a decision around compensation, the takeaway here is have a thoughtful, informed process and document that process, which had not necessarily been the case here in the way that the process played out. And the other is a little bit more thoughtful, right? It's around independence. The court was very disturbed by the close personal and business relationships of the comp committee members with Elon Musk. And they viewed that the compensation grant that was awarded to him was a collaborative discussion, as opposed to an arm's length negotiation. So I think with that in mind, when you think about independence, particularly in the context of compensation, it's important to take a step back, make sure you're considering all factors, but also making sure that the disclosures around relationships and the independence determinations are giving investors what they need so that they can make their own determinations about whether or not somebody was in fact independent or perhaps being unduly influenced, or there is a perception of undue influence by management.
Thanks, Liz. I want to thank both you and Michael for joining us today, and to all of our participants, thanks for your thoughtful questions. And with that, I think we'll go ahead. We're about at time. We'll wrap up. So thank you. It has been a pleasure talking about the upcoming proxy season.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, LizAnn.